Hello again everyone, welcome back to my workshop. I had a request from someone who wants to be able to use his throttle trim in the normal way, but that it does not remember the last position when you switch the radio off and then back on again, and that every time he switches it on, it will start in some predetermined position. Can we do this? Yes, we can, of course, although it's a bit of a complicated way to get there. Well, not complicated, just roundabout. So first thing we're going to do is go to the fine-tuning menu, go to the function curve for the throttle, change it to a 3-point, come down, and we're going to adjust the idle point, this one, to the predetermined value that you want the throttle to start off at every time you switch on the radio. So let's say, for the sake of argument, up here, which it calls 20%. Notice that in the throttle here, it's calling this plus 20%. In any other function, it would call it something like minus 60%. Because with the throttle, it's working, assuming you're working from the bottom upwards rather from the middle out to either end. So we'll say OK to that. Have a look at the effect on the throttle servo. Here we are. So it goes from minus 60% to plus 100%. And the trim affects it from there. But what we want to do is stop it remembering the trim each time we switch on. So say OK to there, come out to that, come to digital trim, throttle. This is the trim buttons here, and we're going to change it. So we're going to change the characteristic of the trim button. So instead of being assigned to the throttle, we're going to assign it to trim reset on. So that every time we switch the transmitter on, it resets back to 0. And there we go. Notice that if we scroll across, it jumps. You cannot get into the value or the stored value, and you cannot change the mode to throttle low. You can change the step and the rate. And later on in this, you might want to reduce the rate of it, but frankly, I don't think you would need to. So anyway, we say OK to that. So now what we've done is we've changed the behavior of those buttons. They no longer affect the throttle. They just produce an output value which will reset back to 0 every time you switch the radio on. So how do we make it affect the throttle? We back out of here. We come to model, function, and we're going to create a new function for the throttle trim. Just for the sake of speed, I'll call it T. You can give it a more meaningful name. And its control is going to be, yes, those buttons. So we press plus, come down to digital trim, that trim there, obviously a different one if you use a different stick mode. And we're happy with that. Say OK to that. So now we have a function called T, which is run by those two trim buttons, and which will reset back to 0 every time we switch on. So it won't remember the previous value when we switched off. So if you'd come down to low trim or high trim, doesn't matter, it'll go back to 0. And now we can mix that to the throttle. So from T to the throttle into the advanced, give it a master value of plus 100%. Now, if we just cancelled it at this point, it would indeed work, but it wouldn't be a throttle low version of the trim. So any trim that we put in will also have an effect at the top end and ruin your servo travels. So what we want to do, of course, is give it the throttle low effect, and we can do this using the switch. So we come into here, move our throttle stick, press the proportional button to this type, not that type because that's still a switch type. We want that proportional, but we don't want it centered. We want it to be all 100% mix when the throttle stick is at the idle value and 0 at the full throttle value. So if we switch off center, we can see that it now just goes from 0 to 100, but it's the wrong way around, because that's with my throttle stick at idle, that's with my throttle stick at full. and I want it to be the other way around, I press rev. So now, with the throttle stick at idle, we'll get 100% of the mix. The throttle stick at full, we get 0% of the mix. Say OK to that, and now we can have a look at the effect of this. So here's my throttle stick, goes from 100 at full throttle to our preset value of -60. I can trim up, and then if I move the throttle stick all the way up, it still just stops at 100%. I can trim down, and again if I move the throttle stick to full throttle, it's still making 100%. Now the important test, will it go back to -60 when we switch off and switch on? So let's leave it at -92. Okay, throttle stick to idle, restart the transmitter. Let's have a look at servo monitor. There we are, it's back at -60, and our trims still work. We can trim up, we can trim down. It still doesn't affect the top end, just the bottom end. So there we are. We can have a trim value that goes back to some preset value, which remember we set in the function curve, and the trim works nicely, but it doesn't remember the value at the point you switched off. It will always go back to the preset value.